7:04.
Okay,
Yeah, we're just
hey, everybody. We have Catherine D'Amico and Coty Keller here again to entertain you with our fourth of the 6-session series on this fragile earth, our island home. Tonight, we're going to talk about specific action on the climate crisis, specific action in our own realms. You may recall last week, we identified the problem as the very high probability that we're going to blow through the 1.5 degree centigrade threshold for increasing temperature, global temperature, compared to pre-industrial levels. We were, by 2017, had blown through 1 degree, and we're on track to blow through 1.5 degree by 2040, unless we take bold action. So the problem, the direct problem is too much carbon in the air. We have well over 400 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We need to get that down to 350 parts per million if we're going to be able to sustain life as we know it on Earth. And there's two parts to the problem. One is we have to reduce the elimination of, or eliminate greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. The experts are telling us we're talking about the order of magnitude of 70 to 100% in the next 10 years. That's an enormous undertaking. And even that's not going to be enough, because the carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stay for thousands of years. If we shut off emissions tomorrow, it still wouldn't solve the problem. We have to take carbon out of the air using photosynthesis and reforestation and soil management, and store something on the order of magnitude of 140 gigatons of carbon in our soils to have a chance so we don't blow through 1.5 degrees centigrade. So that's the problem we talked about last week, and the bold action in general aid. Tonight, we're going to talk about what we can do in our own realms, what we can do. When I talk about we, I talk about us as individuals, households, businesses, religious institutions, nonprofit organizations, condo associations, homeowners, farmers, things we can do in the areas that are under our control, things we can direct, that we affect directly. So here's the agenda tonight. We'll talk a little bit about what kind of an impact we as individuals can make on this big planet. Then we'll talk about energy things, houses and transportation, things that are, well, they're possible to quantify. There's a little bit of math involved. We'll talk about behavioral changes, what we eat, what we waste, and what we buy, and what sort of impact they can have on emissions. Then we'll shift over to the other side of the problem and talk about sequestration, what we can do to, in our realms, to get carbon into the soil from the atmosphere. And we'll talk about some miscellaneous subjects, offsets, paying somebody else to do our work for us, so to speak, divesting from fossil fuels, the concept of putting together a plan if this gets to be a pretty complex project. We'll go back to refrigerant management, which is kind of a no-brainer. We'll talk about maybe influencing other people, and then we'll shift into Q&A. Hopefully in about 40 minutes, I'll be quiet and we'll take your questions. And you can see down the bottom of your screen, there's a little Q&A icon. You can start typing your questions in now, but we won't take them until the end. And then at the end, we'll talk about what's next for next week and what your homework is. All right. So we've got about 128 million households in the United States, I'm told, and about 7.7 billion households on the planet. You might say, what the hell can we do? This is a list of things that I'd offer, as well as some comments by Bill Gates, things that I've been thinking about that make it worthwhile. The quote on the right from Edmund Burke, the Irish philosopher, nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little, is my first offering. And every little bit helps and it all adds up. Also, I've found in our family's quest to reduce emissions and sequester carbon that we've actually wound up saving a lot of money. And we've also improved our health. So there are byproducts to our quest that are very worthwhile. You can also set an example. Every time somebody sees you doing the right thing for the climate crisis, that's one more person that you've influenced and one more person who could be chipping in. Also in week one, we learned it really is the right thing to do. We have a moral obligation to, as our faith leaders said, to restore the creation that God gave us. We also have a lot of climate injustice that needs to be corrected. So it really is the right thing to do. Bill Gates, in his new book, which I just read this last week, makes a very good point. He says that, and I'm quoting here, we're not powerless, and we don't have to be a politician or a philanthropist to make a difference. We have influence as a citizen, consumer, employer, or employee. Our personal actions, for example, driving an electric vehicle or eating less meat, sends important signals to the marketplace. But anyway, I won't lecture you on that. The choice is yours, but it's a question we all have to answer. So let's launch off into the emissions. What can we do? One way to get started might be to put this in context, but with a frame of reference offered by the Union of Concerned Scientists. The graph on the left is not from the Union of Concerned Scientists, but they tell us that we as Americans have kind of a special obligation because we emit more per person than anybody else in the world. You can see by the graph on the left, there's us at the top, 16.5 million metric tons per person per year of carbon dioxide. That's about 4 times the global average. So we're using we're emitting 4 times more than the average person on Earth. We're using twice as much as the industrialized Western European nations that, by the way, have a very high standard of living. We're using way more than our share. Another way to look at it is where our emissions go. This pie chart on the right is from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I know not everybody is actually none of us are average. So these numbers or percentages don't fit precisely for everybody, but they give us a frame of reference. So where we can see most of the emissions are going, it might be the places that we look in our own quest to determine how we can reduce our own emissions. You can see home heating is between home heating and cooling and other home energy uses is over 30%. For the average American, the building itself is the greatest emitter, followed by transportation, 28%, of which about 90% for most people is their automobile. And then I think it's not surprising from what we learned about the food system, 14% of our average person's emissions have to do with food and what food we waste. And then 28% has to do with stuff that we buy. And we know that our growth economy is a problem from what we talked about in the last couple of weeks. So let's move on into the biggest chunk for most of us first, and that's the home, or we'll also consider buildings as well. We're not just talking about homes here, we're talking about businesses and churches and synagogues and mosques and government buildings and nonprofit buildings. The idea behind buildings, or the logical approach that's suggested by the Union of Concerned Scientists, is to determine how much energy and of what type is being consumed in your home or your building, and then estimate the resulting emissions. And that'll give you an idea of how much of a problem you have or how much you're contributing to the problem. And then once we have the total emissions, then we're going to think about ways to reduce our consumption of energy. And then after we've reduced the amount of energy we use, transition the rest to zero emission energy sources. Remember, we want to try to get to 70 to 100% reduction or elimination of emissions in the next 10 years. So it's one way to look at it as a three-step process. 1, 2, 3. The first part is to calculate your building's emissions, your carbon footprint over a period of time. Typically, a year is used to deal with annual outcomes. This is done by first counting all the fuel used from your utility bills, the kilowatt hours of electricity, the therms of natural gas, the gallons of oil, the cords of wood, the pounds of propane, etc. Your electric utility will get their power from a variety of sources. So you'll need to account for the percentages coming from coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, solar, etc. Math gets a little burdensome. Once you have the units counted up for the various energy sources, you can multiply them by the energy emission factors provided by the U.S. Energy Information Agency. I provided those factors in the reference section for tonight's presentation, and you'll get those emailed to you tomorrow. And you add it all up and you have an estimate of the annual emissions from your building. I said, that sounds like a lot of work. Well, there's some tools you can use if you find that that math is too much for you. You can try one of the carbon counters that I'm providing in the references for tonight, or you can have somebody do an energy audit for you, maybe for free. And whether you need help with the audit or not to do the math, I'd suggest a professional audit anyway. A professional audit will not only help you determine your emissions, it will help identify ways to conserve energy and be more efficient. So the second step is to reduce consumption. Think about ways to reduce the amount of energy you consume. Some people use investments in insulation, reducing air leaks, upgrading heating and cooling systems and appliances. Use a programmable thermostat, or better yet, learn to live with warmer temperatures in summer and cooler homes in the winter. You can join the lighting revolution and switch everything to LED bulbs. How about heating your water with the sun? As we learned last week, using the sun to heat your water is a great way to knock as much as 25% off your energy bills. And if you're having a professional audit, which I suggest, ways to reduce consumption, suggestions for that should be part of the outcome of the energy audit. Okay, so the third step, once you've reduced your energy use, you think about the transition from combustible energy fuel sources, fossil fuels, wood, etc. This is a notion we talked about last week of electrifying almost everything and powering it with zero emission sources. Is it practical or cost effective to, for example, install an electric heat pump to heat your house and then power it from the sun? A good audit will include information on these considerations. And then finally, if you're lucky enough to be in a position to be building a new home for yourself or a new building for your business from scratch, it's entirely feasible to create buildings that create more energy than they use. I'll put links in the references to show information from the Green Building Council and also the Zero Energy Ready Homes from the Department of Energy. Okay. As I said before, none of us are average. Everybody's situation is different. There's not going to be one cookie cutter solution to make your house more efficient in reducing your emissions. But here are 3 examples I have personal knowledge of. One is a home in New England that was able to reduce their energy use by 2/3 It was a young family. They couldn't actually afford to live in the house that they wanted to purchase because the energy use was so high. But they got an energy audit, and with the help of the information in there, by beefing up the insulation, upgrading the windows, installing programmed thermostats and reducing their heat, and installing solar domestic hot water, they cut their energy bills by 2/3 and were able to afford the home. The second example is a large furniture retailer down here in Port Charlotte, Florida, that saved $40,000 annually from their electric utility bills. And this was enough to almost double the profitability on their bottom line. The main recommendations they had that they followed were to increase the insulation in their ceilings and their walls, and they shifted over to solar or electric instead of buying their electricity from the utility. And $40,000 a year is nothing to stick at. The third example, it was a middle-class family that reduced their carbon footprint to net zero with a combination of conservation measures and rooftop solar. Meanwhile, making a handsome return on their investment. There's a reference in the, or I cited the reference in the references that I'll send you tonight. It's called the 40,000 pound carbon diet. Anyway, they reduced their consumption by super insulating the attic, using ceiling fans instead of air conditioning when the heat was below 85 degrees, and funding and repairing air leaks that they found with the help of an energy audit, and using solar hot water to heat the pool and the domestic hot water instead of having that done by electricity. And then, of course, they generated electricity from their sun to power the house. They also power their electric vehicle and electric boat with the power they generate from the solar photovoltaic system on their roof. They have achieved really net zero emissions. You know, over the course of a year, they make more money, they make more electricity than they use. Some months and some nights they get electricity from the grid, but on average, they're sending more electricity out to the grid than they're bringing home. So 3 different situations. They had one common factor. Each one of these situations used the information from an energy audit to help gain the information they needed to make these achievements. Okay, let's move from buildings and houses to transportation. The average American uses most of their emissions from transportation come from vehicles, which is a very simple calculation. It's about 20 pounds of carbon dioxide for every gallon of gasoline you burn, and a little bit more than that, a little over 22 pounds per gallon for diesel. It's pretty easy to calculate your footprint from your vehicles. And you probably don't add up all the gallons you buy, but you can do some estimates with how many miles per gallon you get and look at how many miles you drive a year and come up with an estimate and see whether you've got a really serious problem with your vehicles. And if you, like most people, you probably are emitting a whole heck of a lot from your vehicles. So the first step you can do is think about is conserving. You can, and this sounds radical, but you can actually avoid driving and use public transportation. The Union of Concerned Scientists suggest we reduce or eliminate long distance travel, because that gets problematic, because most of the time we do that, we do it in an airplane. And you can see from the graph on the left, the difference in cost in carbon emissions from a plane to a car to a train is dramatic. And we're talking about, happens to be driving across Sweden. But you can do that by train for about 5 pounds of carbon per person. It's about 135 pounds per carbon per person to drive that in an efficient car, and like 260 pounds per person if you fly. So taking care to choose your means of long distance travel can really make a difference. And then finally, you can only conserve so much. Shifting to zero emission forms of transportation is the ultimate solution, so to speak. Bikes, electric vehicles, and you have to remember, you don't want to charge your electric vehicle from the utility company unless you have to. If you charge it from a solar system, you'll really have zero emissions. But even so, even charging from the sun, charging from a dirty grid also is going to reduce your emissions in an electric vehicle. It's the best solution is to go zero emission. So we're talking about a lot of information here. It's going to take a while to gather this and think about it for your buildings and your transportation. I don't want to freak you out. I'm hoping that you'll think about calming down, gathering the information, thinking about this over a period of time, and don't put the pressure on yourself to make a decision right away. You don't want to be overwhelmed. There's no need to make a decision right away. But eventually you'll want to consider the costs and the benefits of each possible option and do what you think is within your means. So quantifying emissions and getting the costs of the alternatives for buildings and transportation is technically more easy because you can actually add all the things up and count them and come up with quantifiable information. We're going to move into some more subjective areas where we don't have those precise numbers, what we eat and waste and stuff we buy and sequestration. But I hope you'll think about this as in a holistic way and think about your carbon footprint in all these areas and look at it as a whole and make decisions about where you're most comfortable taking action. What we eat and waste. The Union of Concerned Scientists say that what we eat and what we buy and throw away accounts for 14% of the average American's emissions. Again, we're not all average. But typically, the typical American family, if there is one, generates about 6,000 pounds of greenhouse gases annually by what we eat and what we waste. That's a big footprint, so it's worth examining alternatives to the typical American diet. The Union of Concerned Scientists advise that if you are anything like the average American family, your best option from an emissions standpoint is to reduce your consumption of meat, especially beef. That's because a pound of beef is responsible for some 18 times the emissions of a pound of pasta. As mentioned last week, if cattle were their own nation, they would be the world's third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Anyway, back to the Union of Concerned Scientists. They say the only food that comes close to emission intensity of beef is cheese. Beef and cheese, and poor cows. The average family of four that cuts their meat intake in half could roughly avoid 3 tons of emissions annually. That's about the same as a year's worth of driving. The Environmental Working Group suggests that if you must eat meat, chicken and fish are your best choice. This is again from a climate standpoint. If you must eat red meat, it's been suggested that we avoid feedlot beef. As a friend of mine, Ely Sparks, an eco farmer, explains, animals raised on land Also used for crops, add to soil fertility and rebuild topsoil. That's the silvopasture concept we talked about last week. We want to avoid feedlots for other good reasons. They're somewhat, if not totally inhumane, and they take up space that could be used by forests. Project Drawdown, we've talked about several times. Dozens of scientists and economists worldwide rank a plant-rich diet as the number 4 solution out of 100 to the climate crisis. They say that plant-rich diets reduce emissions and also tend to be healthier, leading to lower rates of chronic disease. And specifically, a 2016 study tells us that business as usual emissions could be reduced as much as 70% by adopting a vegan diet, and reduce 63% for a vegetarian diet, which includes cheese, eggs, and milk. On top of that, $1 trillion in annual healthcare costs and lost productivity could be saved. So reducing one's consumptions of meat, including fish, and adapting a plant-rich diet is clearly good for the climate, good for our health, and good for our budget. I'll ask you to please consider supporting community-sponsored agriculture, or CSAs. Buying and eating crops from a local CSA is a good step, not only for a healthy diet, but a sustainable food system. A typical CSA implements many of the strategies that result in fewer carbon emissions and more storage of carbon in the soil. On top of that, if the CSA is organic, and most of the ones that I'm concerned with that we know about are, it means they do not use chemicals. They're not supporting the chemical manufacture process with all its greenhouse gas emissions, or the release of more nitrous oxide from the fertilizer in the soil. Last week, we said a third of the food raised or prepared does not make it from farm or factory to fork. It's wasted. Union of Concerned Scientists recommends 3 strategies to reduce food waste at home. 1 is to buy less. 2 is to compost. Compost what you don't eat. For every ton composted, 1 ton of carbon dioxide does not go to the atmosphere. Kitchen scraps can be an important part of our efforts to sustain our soils. We can also, number 3 is participate in food recovery programs. This involves perishable food that would otherwise go to waste and donating it to people in need. I want to give a shout out, make a pitch for Forks Over Knives. If you're interested in a vegan plus whole foods diet, in other words, avoiding processed food, check out their movie or their book or magazines. You'll see them in the references that I'll send you tomorrow night. I can't tell you exactly how many emissions this eating style has avoided, but I can tell you my cholesterol numbers are lower than they've ever been in my life. Last we talked about the growth economy and the problems our behavior, our buying behavior, and our consumption behavior is causing us. I think we mentioned that the people at this spaceship Earth have estimated that by July of every year, we've used up the resources that are allocated for the whole year. I mean, we're just driving ourselves into the grave. And 26% of the average American's emissions comes from buying stuff. So suggested strategies from the Union of Concerned Scientists are pretty simple. Buy less stuff, purchase recycled or reclaimed items, buy used things instead of new. You can refurbish and repair things instead of discarding than buying new. We tried this last month. We had an old table on our lanai. We've had about 15 or 20 years that the paint was chipping off, the cushions were shot. We went shopping around and we said, now we could actually pay a local metal worker to sandblast this table and the chairs and repaint them, and pay a local upholstery person to give us new cushions. And we wound up with a really dynamite set that's actually of higher quality than the new stuff. And we didn't go to the landfill with it. It makes us feel very good. Another important thing is to pay attention to how goods are manufactured. The Union of Concerned Scientists tell us that things made of concrete or steel will involve greater emissions than sustainably grown wood. Wood is a low energy and low emissions material compared with steel and concrete and plastic for packaging and building, but it only when it is not the cause of deforestation. We have to buy wood whose products are certified as sustainably grown. That FSC stamp, the Forest Stewardship Council, you need to see that on your wood products. Okay, so that's it for acting to limit our emissions. Let's shift to taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Let's talk about sequestration. I want to give a shout out first to Pastor Susan at St. James Church in Long Beach, who put us onto this movie. It's a documentary called The Biggest Little Farm. If you haven't seen it, I'd really suggest you take a look at it. It's about a couple who follows their dream and farms by nature. And they do all the cool things that we talked about last week: silvopasture, regenerative agriculture, composting and fertilizers management. It's really incredible how much they can accomplish and how they're feeding the soil and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. But we're not all farmers. Most of us, or a lot of us, have access to land around our residences, our businesses. Sorry to spell business wrong. If we live in a condo or have a homeowners association, there are common areas that can be transitioned to natural landscapes which sequester carbon, use less fertilizer, they're friendlier to the soils. We can also, in the land that we have access to or have influence over, reduce or eliminate fertilizers and herbicides, which cause emissions in their production and in their use. And we can get involved with reforestation projects. There's a lot of land that's unproductive as it is, and volunteer groups can take control of that land and plant a lot of trees and make good things happen. I'm working with a veterans group down here. We just, some land adjacent to some Waterbond property in Sarasota, Florida. We planted 100 trees on a third of an acre of land that within 10 years is going to be sequestering a whole lot of carbon. Okay. Some of you have probably heard about offsets. The idea is to pay somebody else to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere. For example, if you're flying long distance, you can purchase carbon offsets to plant trees, perhaps, to equal the emissions caused by the flight. Offset fans argue that carbon offsetting will help us make the transition to a more sustainable future. I'd suggest that one should keep in mind that the offsets cannot replace the good you do by reducing your own emissions. Offsets don't alter the fact that the gallon of fuel not burned or the megawatt of energy not used is the surest carbon reduction strategy of all. I suggest the best strategy is to take bold action, reduce your emissions, sequester carbon by natural landscaping and planting trees. And if you have disposable income, consider buying offsets, paying other people to plant trees. The divesting from fossil fuels movement has become popular in the last decade. That's something I'd suggest you think about doing with your own banking and investment holdings, shifting from holdings that are vested in fossil fuels to more responsible funds. And this goes beyond your own personal assets. If you have influence in your workplace or at a nonprofit, you might think about influencing them to consider divesting from fossil fuels. Why fuel the monster? And if you choose wisely, socially responsible funds earn just as much money, if not more, than those which have investments in fossil fuels. So there's some tools that I've listed in the reference sheet that I'll give you tomorrow night. Just a heads up, there's 3 carbon counters in there, 3 different ways to help you estimate your emissions. A real simple one, a medium grade one, and a pretty complex one that involves interfacing with Google Apps. My solutions portfolio was developed by a couple that teaches a course at Ringling College in Sarasota on climate. It's a real cool portfolio. It's a neat way to keep track and identify things that you want to do and keep a record of it on a spreadsheet. The 40,000 pound carbon diet is a story of a middle-class family that reduced their emissions and made money doing it. The references in the tools portion of the references. Also in there, I've listed the energy factors, the numbers you'll need to do to calculate your home's emissions depending upon where the energy comes from. The iTree is a neat program by the U.S. Forest Service that will help you select trees to plant based on not only the emissions that they will sequester or the carbon that they'll sequester, but also what they'll do in terms of holding water and providing shade, doing other cool things. And then there's 2 books listed there that have to do with suggestions for your diet. Eat to Live is a plant-based diet suggestion. It's not totally vegetarian. And Forks Over Knives, as I mentioned before, those references there will give you some insights into getting into a total vegan diet, vegan plus whole foods, no processed foods. Okay, so I'm going to suggest if you get into this really heavy, you're going to be talking about investing a significant amount of your time and money, that it's probably worth making a formal plan. I'd suggest that you actually write down what you expect to get from the different options you're going to take with your buildings and your transportation, in particular, and your diet. And then periodically come back to what you expect these things to develop for you and look at it. Are you achieving the emissions and the cost savings that you hope for? Is your health improving as you hope for? If not, you want to change your plan. It's time to go back and gather some more information and rethink it. This is a significant undertaking, and it's worth doing it. It's worth doing it in a way that's somewhat like a strategic plan. Something that I really don't think we need to think about, so it's really not part of the decision process, is refrigerant management. No matter what else you decide to do or not to do, please manage your refrigerant emissions. The words from Drawdown, who have refrigerant management as the #1 solution to the climate crisis, is because 90% of refrigerant emissions happen at the end of life. An effective disposal of those currently in circulation is essential. After being carefully removed and stored, refrigerants can be purified for reuse or transformed into other chemicals that do not cause warming. But that's not going to happen unless you dispose of your air conditioner or your fridge in the proper way. Please pay attention to that. Final suggestion for something to think about is thinking about using your influence to advance the awareness and education about the climate crisis. You can think about places that you have an in, maybe at your workplace or in your neighborhood, in your schools, adult education courses, homeowners associations, houses of worship. Where can you contribute your talents beyond your own personal plan to spread the word about what needs to happen and what the situation is? Because information and education is the key to being able to manage the change that needs to happen. These are daunting behaviors that we're asking people to undertake, and they're based on a situation that is critical to understand. So if you can help get the word out by contributing in this area, it can really help us achieve what we need to achieve. Plus, it'll also act as a force against the special interests and misinformation. So please consider contributing to education and awareness. All right, I think I've talked enough. We've got plenty of things to, plenty of things to think about with buildings and transportation, what we eat, what we waste, stuff we buy, sequestration, offsets, divesting, making a plan. Let's open the floor up to questions.
All right, Coty, we got some good questions tonight. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Okay, first one, Brian would like to know, how does carbon get sequestered into the soil?
Photosynthesis is the area. I wish my wife was not in the other room. It's all by photosynthesis. It's the chlorophyll and the green leaves take the carbon dioxide into the plant and work to create sugars and other carbons that is in part used to nourish the plant. And it is also distributed down through the roots into the soil, where it creates a ballet of sorts with the microbes to have this great cool process. And it's amazing. It's about the reforestation that we're doing up in the celery fields in Sarasota. About a third of the carbon is actually stored in the biomass in the plants itself, and the rest of it is stored in the soil.
Okay, Karen wants to know, how does one go about getting an energy audit and what is the cost? Good question.
That is a good question, and it depends where you are. I know people from our church are looking into getting an energy audit for the church, and the New York State, if you go to the New York State energy website, there are several programs, some of them connected with utility companies that are some free. If you just Google energy audit and say where your location is, you'll get information. And the most important thing is you want a professional energy audit, and you don't want an energy audit from somebody who's trying to sell you something. And if you get an energy audit from, let's say, a solar installer or a air conditioning company, it's like, asking your life insurance agent what the best way to to invest is, because he or she is going to have their own interests at heart. So I've done some research down in Florida and on Long Island, and I found if you just Google energy audit in your area, you'll get that. And then you want to ask those questions. And a lot of them are free, but don't get one free from a life insurance agent. And if you can't find anything, send me an email. I'll see if I can help you out.
Okay, Elizabeth wanted some more information about when you were mentioning heating water by the sun. Did you mean through solar energy collectors for electricity, or is this more direct heating of the water from the sun without converting to electricity?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Elizabeth. I'm talking about heating it directly from the radiant energy from the sun. If you think about, if you want to heat electricity from a photovoltaic solar, you're thinking about you're going to make electricity from the sun, and then you're going to put it into a very inefficient resistive heater element in a hot water tank. That's not a very efficient way to do it. I'm talking about heating it directly from the sun. We've used that in heating a pool. People in business use it to heat water for industrial purposes. We use it in both of our houses to heat the hot water that we cook and bathe with. Totally different systems. It's not efficient to heat hot water by solar electric. And actually what happens is, if you heat your water with the sun directly, then you want to electrify your rest of your house later, you don't need as big of a solar electric system. Good question.
Coty, I'm going to jump in with a related question for myself.
Yeah, let me just say one more thing. And Elizabeth, if you go back to the references for last week, under there's a section for project drawdown in the references, and there's a specific bullet for heating water. You can click on that solution, which I think was like number 28 or something. It's really high on the list, and it talks specifically about that in more detail than I just talked about. Yes, Catherine.
I'm just curious, is an InstaHot system more energy efficient if you have solar than a traditional hot water heater if you don't have room to do this hot water system?
I'm not familiar with an InstaHot.
Like it just goes through and heats the water as you're using it, not storing it in a big hot water heater?
Okay, so this is a heating element under your sink or something that.
Yeah, I think they go in the house as like.
Yeah, and how is it? Where does it get its energy from? Electricity or propane? Or
probably electricity, yeah.
Okay. If it's a resistive heater, that is just like a heating element, like you have in a hot water heater, it's not particularly efficient. If it's from a heat pump, it's probably more efficient. And now, whether it's more efficient than doing something that's really inefficient, like heating your hot water from oil or a natural gas or a regular hot water heater in the basement, and then you're talking about like two bad solutions and which one is worse.
Got it. Okay, Barbara has a question. She wants to know if you have any suggestions for apartment dwellers, especially those living in apartment buildings run by the city. Long Beach has 4 senior apartment buildings, each about 7 stories with 72 studio and 1-bedroom apartments per building.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Barbara, because you don't have discretion over that situation. And I think my suggestion would be, and I know the city of Long Beach has people who actually, their job is to think about sustainability and the climate crisis. You might find some allies there who could work with the community. I guess the thing to do, my suggestion is to alert people to what the problem is and have an energy audit done of your building and come up with the recommendations to reduce emissions. The first one would be certainly, I think, by conserving energy with insulation and that sort of thing. But my suggestion would be to talk to them, get them on board with the concept, and get an energy audit and see where that leads you. And the same thing would hold for a co-op or a condo, is to get the people on board with the concept of the benefits of reducing the footprint of the building and getting an audit and seeing where that takes you in terms of recommendations. Thank you, Barbara.
Doreen has a good question. Most of the time an old refrigerator is removed by the company that you buy the new one from. Are there any regulations for them regarding the old refrigerator?
Yeah, they damn well are. And I know one guy who followed the Home Depot truck when it left his house, knowing how dangerous it was, and he followed him to the source, and they were right on. They were spot on. They delivered it to the facility. You know, he followed it for a long time. They delivered it to a facility which knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't just throw the thing in a landfill. They went through the process of extracting those dangerous refrigerants from it. So yeah, there are very strict rules and there's laws, and people can get in big trouble. So what I'm suggesting we do is that you may not want to follow Home Depot's truck for 6 miles to the facility, but you want to make sure that you have good faith that the process, whether they're picking it up on the curb or whether you're dropping it off at the mid station somewhere, dropping your window unit off, that it's going to be treated correctly. And if you get any inkling that it's not, call the authorities, because it's a serious offense.
Yeah, and if they're not putting yours in the right place, that means they're not putting them every single day in the right place.
That's right.
We have a question from Marin, who I believe you're familiar with. Hi, Marin. What do you personally, Coty, think is the most important thing that we could do out of all the topics you answered today to decrease the emissions and help the Earth?
Oh, I think it really depends on our own individual circumstances and gifts and situation. So for example, some of my wealthier friends who have wandered in their ways and have the means to reduce their emissions by changing their systems and how they travel and how they drive, that might be their greatest contribution, is to take some of their resources and invest it there. Somebody in the position like you, Marin, might find that the industries that you go into, you'll have the greatest opportunity to affect how they work. Or perhaps if you wanted to be a teacher, the way you could alert people to the problem and help them find solutions, the energy, the education and awareness might be the best. I think it really depends on your station in life and where you are and what talents you have and what resources you have to pick and choose. And it's going to take, that's why I was suggesting that you think about this in terms of the decision process, because there's a lot of factors to consider. And it really depends on where you are and what you control and what your mission in life is or could be. And Marin, I'm very anxious to hear what your decision is over time. Marin's one of my granddaughters. Good to see you, Marin.
Okay, we have a few more questions. I want to get to them. Judith would like to know, do you have any philosophical or practical thoughts about how the US collectively can reduce our per person energy consumption or carbon footprint when we have such temptations all around us every day to consume things?
Yes, I've got about 45 minutes worth of thoughts on that. And Judith, I'm going to have to until next week when we talk about what our government should be doing.
Okay. Marjorie says, recently I heard in an environmental class that emissions from 4 pounds of beef equals a flight from New York to London. Can that be true?
It might be. I'd have to see the, if you send me the reference, I'll look into it and get back to you. We know from what the Union of Concerned Scientists tell us is that a pound of pasta, a pound of beef has the same emissions as 18 pounds of pasta. You can get an idea for the scale of the problem, or the notion that cows, if cows were all in one nation, they would be the 3rd or 4th largest emitter on the planet. So it's a lot. But this, if you send me, you'll see my email in the email you get tonight. You could send me the reference, and I'd look up the citation and see if that's accurate or not. It depends on a lot of things.
Okay.
It's funny, flying to London is really is a lot of emissions. The rule of thumb is I think it's a pound per mile, pound of carbon per mile. So what is it? 3,000 miles across the ocean. So that's like 3,000 pounds. I mean, that's a lot of people's carbon budget for the whole year. That's a lot of carbon. The beef is bad too. I suggest you avoid both of them.
No meat, no flying.
That's right. Remember how Greta Thunberg came to the U.S. from Sweden for to talk to the UN. She came in a sailboat.
Imad wants to know, why is China not on the chart as one of the countries that produces high emissions? I think it was on there. It was just
it might. Yeah, it's China would, if we had a chart that showed the emissions per country, period, China would be at the top. The chart that I showed was emissions per capita. And since there's over 1 billion people in China and we only have 300 million, we go to the top per capita.
Elizabeth has a good point. Note that reducing lawns will require mowing, is very important. I don't know how much carbon lawn mowers produce, but I read that running a gasoline-powered lawnmower for 1 hour emits as much air pollution as driving a car for 100 miles.
Well, we know you can calculate that, Elizabeth, by the emission factor for gasoline is I think 9.6 pounds of CO2 per gallon. You can calculate how many gallons of gasoline you're using in your lawnmower, and see how many, and compare that to how much you're burning in your car. Yeah, lawns are bad for a lot of things. Well, although you don't have to cut your lawn with a gasoline-powered mower. We have some crazy people in our neighborhood who actually cut their grass, or what really isn't grass, it's a natural turf, with an electric lawnmower, and then they charge the batteries for the electric lawnmower with the sun. So there's no emissions involved. And lawns are bad for other reasons too. Most people fertilize their lawns. When that fertilizer is manufactured, it produces a lot of emissions, and then whatever nitrogen is not taken into the ground and immediately used by the grass itself is contributing nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. So it's carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. It's bad. That's why a strong recommendation is to think about transforming your landscape, including your lawn, to a natural landscape, a native landscape that doesn't use fertilizer.
You know, I'm supportive of that.
Absolutely.
I actually do have some statistics from Audubon's work with native plants that there's about 40 million acres of grass in the United States, which is an insane amount of area. And we burn through about 800 million gallons per year of gasoline using weed whackers and mowers. And we spill about 17 million gallons of fuel while trying to refill lawn equipment. So that's just one little sample of some of the detriment that's caused by lawns, and definitely native plants. And there's a lot of plants that trap a lot more carbon, which is, you know, one of Coty's main points of sequestration.
That's a really good point. So we can think about your own yard, if you have one, or the common areas of your condo or your homeowners association, the yard areas of your businesses. Those kind of transformations can make a lot of difference. Okay, great questions, everybody. So we're past the top of the hour. Let me just say quick, as I told Judith, next week we'll talk about specific actions in government. I mean, each of us can do our own little part, but what happens globally with governments and within states and localities is going to make all the difference. So next week we'll talk about where the experts tell us the governments can get their most leverage and what sorts of things we should expect from them. And then, as before, tonight or tomorrow night, an email will come to you. It'll have your homework. If you're ready for it, there'll be a quiz. There'll be a reminder to register for next session, number 5. There'll be a references. It's about a 5-page reference section. It's got a lot of stuff in there, not just the references for the thoughts that I passed on tonight, but it's got a section on the different tools that we talked about to help you calculate your carbon footprint and things you can do to make the decisions that you want to decide what you want to do yourselves. There'll be a copy of the slideshow and a recording, God willing, of tonight's webinar. I can't wait till tomorrow to get the email. Just go to tinyurl.com with Greta, and you can tap into those things in about an hour. You need about an hour to put it all together. So we want to thank you all for joining us tonight and wish you all a safe evening. And we'll see you next week. And thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Catherine, bye-bye.